There we go.
Okay, welcome everyone who's joining us for today's Jewish Gen Talk with Chuck Weinstein. We have a few minutes before we get started. We have a fascinating topic today. Let us know in the chat where you are participating and where you're logging in from. It's great to have you here with us, and we will get started in just a couple of minutes. So we have people from Fairfax, Virginia, Long Island, Orlando, Florida, United Kingdom, Montreal, Indianapolis, Maryland, Toronto, Connecticut, Israel, Portland, Oregon, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Efrat in Israel. It's coming from Seattle, Washington, West Orange, San Antonio, Albuquerque, UK, Nottingham, Israel, Santa Rosa, California. We have people from all over the world joining us for today's topic, from Alberta, Anchorage, Alaska, Bonita Springs in Florida, that's Barry Lewin. Sheldon Altman from Valley Village in California. Welcome, glad you're with us. We have Palm Springs, St. Paul, Minnesota, Hamilton, Ontario. For those of you who are just logging in, we're going to get started in just about a minute. And you can let us know where you are logging in from in the chat. We're glad that you're with us, and we're about to get started. See, we have people from all over the world, somebody else from Santa Rosa, Las Vegas. So people from all over the world are joining us today. We're glad you're with us. We are now going to get started. We're right at the 2 o'clock mark here in New York City. My name is Avram Grohl, and I serve as Executive Director of Jewish Gen. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's Jewish Gen Talk, which is the third in our 4-part series of using DNA to engage in family research that we've been conducting this month. And so far, we've learned a little bit about the how-to, right? What do you do? How can you use DNA to further your understanding of your family and identifying additional relatives? And last week, we learned about some of the practical, ethical, and legal ramifications of engaging with this type of research. And today, we're going to hear real-life examples of someone who has been the beneficiary of using DNA. The session is of using DNA analysis. The session is being recorded, but as always, you are encouraged to take notes along the way. If you would like to ask questions, we hope to get to some of them towards the end. And as always, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and please keep them as general in nature as possible. You can use the chat, which will stay open. You can use the chat to connect with each other and to share your information if you'd like to connect. If you would like to not be disturbed by the chat, you can close the window so that you should not see it during the program. Finally, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is where the webinar will be made accessible. And if you subscribe, you'll get notified each time we add a new video. And if you're not subscribed, please sign up for the discussion group. That is the place where you can connect with thousands of researchers from around the world. It's a place where you can stay notified and informed of things happening throughout the Jewish Gen universe, and specifically for our audience today, where you can stay informed of future Jewish Gen Talks and Jewish Gen webinars. A little bit about Chuck Weinstein, who really needs no introduction within the Jewish Gen world. He is the Towns Coordinator of our Jewish Gen Ukraine Research Division. He is a past Volunteer of the Year. He is past President of the JGS of Long Island and is currently the Vice President of the Genealogy Federation of Long Island. He is a professional researcher and an all-around great guy. So without any further ado, I pass it over to Chuck Weinstein.
Well, thank you, Rami, and I appreciate the all-around good guy reference. That's it's a nice thing to hear. And for all of you who are celebrating the holiday season, Good Yontif, we're going to talk today about DNA for adoptees. And let me get my screen share up here. Avrami, I'm going to cut you off. And we're going to put this up here. And let's see how all this works. It should work well. With any luck. Hopefully all of you are seeing my screen now.
Yes, we see it.
And so without further ado, I've titled the talk DNA for Adoptees, or how instead of a bicycle, I got a sister for my birthday. And as we go along, you will notice that I found out all about this literally on the day before my birthday about 4 years ago. And so it's material that I am still processing. I have a wonderful sister for the first time in my life. I never had a sister before. And I never had an older sibling. And that's, I shouldn't say that because I believe she's on this talk and she doesn't think of herself as older. So I'll leave it at that. But we're going to talk about, first of all, a little bit about DNA and how it works and what it is for those of you who are not familiar. For those of you who are very familiar, it should be just a little refresher. And then we're going to talk about what I did, what happened, and the surprises that I got along the way. So all of you, I hope, will bear with me and follow along. If you have questions, as Avrami said, please put them in the chat. And at the end, we'll go through as many of them as we can. You may notice that my email address is down on the bottom left corner of this slide. At the end, I'll have it up again. Feel free to drop me an email after this is over, and I will get back to you, and we'll go from there. And so without further ado, let me start out by saying that all of us have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And if you look at a diagram here, you will see that there are 22 pairs that basically do everything, instruct the various cells of our body to do everything that we need. Every cell in the body has an identical set of these chromosomes. And so there's chromosomes for blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, what have you, blonde hair, brunette, dark, whatever. There are also chromosomes that instruct the body so that most of us have 10 fingers and 10 toes and so on and so forth. There are two chromosomes, one of the pairs that are not identical or not similar in nature. And by the way, each of these pairs, we get one from our mother and one from our father. So that's why there may be a great resemblance between you and one parent or the other parent, or there may be no resemblance at all. And the fact that you look a little bit different than your parents doesn't necessarily mean anything, and you shouldn't take it personally. But that all has to do with which sets of chromosomes each parent provided you. But the last two are probably the most important for a lot of different areas. And they are labeled X and Y. And so each chromosome has millions of genes on it. And again, the genes give the instructions to the various cells of the body about what they should be doing and what they should look like. So DNA is essentially the building block of life. Everything that we know about human existence starts out with DNA. And that's a very important thing to know and understand. We get about 50% from each parent, and it's not exactly 50%. So when we look at DNA matches, you may see that you match one parent at 47% and the other at 53%. That's not unusual. And we go from there. Y DNA is passed only through the male line. If you have a Y chromosome, you will be a male. And that passes from father to son. It is relatively unchanged from generation to generation. So using Y DNA, we can trace the male family line back, in some cases, many centuries. And particularly for people whose traditions are that they are Kohanim or Levites or Levim, the there are markers that are often, but not always, found in the Y DNA that would indicate a probable connection there. X-DNA passes from the mother to the sons and the daughters. So if you are a male, you would typically have, not typically, you will have an X and a Y chromosome in that final pair. If you are a female, you will have an X and an X, and one of those X's you get from your father, because in the process of conception, sperm has both male and female sex chromosomes, and women only have female sex chromosomes. So the X-DNA passes both from the mother to both the sons and the daughters, and we go from there. So again, to summarize, XX, you are a female. XY, you are a male. And YYY, Delilah. Sorry, Tom Jones. So there are some ethical issues that need to be considered in your DNA research. And I want to make sure that everybody is very clear that when you do DNA research, you're finding out an awful lot about your family, including things that may be family secrets, things that people don't want anybody else to know about. They're huge shames, they're whatever to the family. And you need to consider each step of the way accordingly. First and foremost, you should read the genetic genealogy standards that were developed by genealogists and scientists back in 2015. They are available through a number of sources, but if you Google genetic genealogy standards, you will get these. DNA test results can reveal misattributed parentage. I personally know a couple of people who, through DNA testing, determined that the man they assumed had been their father all their lifetimes, in fact, was not. And in a couple of cases, we're able to determine, at least in one case that I'm aware of, we're able to determine that her father is actually the next door neighbor at the time she was born. Thank you for the census to help release that. She's very upset with both her mother and her father. She doesn't know if her father ever knew, but her mother certainly did. And both of them are long since gone, so she can't gripe at them. But that is an issue that you may find out. And it may not just be a parental thing, it may be grandparents and so forth. You may find health information that is disturbing to you or disturbing to other members of your family. You may find previously unknown family members, and that happens quite a bit. And you may have this beautiful, well-researched family tree that somebody in your family has worked on for years and put it all together, and DNA reveals that no, not all those people are related the way that the tree says they are. Now, understand something. We have all sorts of documentation, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, other pieces of documentation for information that we put in a family tree. All of that is paper documentation, and it's very important. DNA cannot replace the paper documentation in actually putting together a documented family tree. However, the paper documentation may be at odds with the DNA. And if that's the case, unfortunately, I have to tell you, the DNA is the correct answer there. So be aware of that. Those are some of the unexpected outcomes that come out of DNA. Quick story, appeared in local newspapers here a few years ago. Young woman was reading an article about a genetic disease called Huntington's disease. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with it, it's the disease that killed Woody Guthrie, among others. And it is passed from father to son, and it's what they call a dominant gene, which means if you have the gene, you will develop Huntington's disease. And it's a neuromuscular ailment. It ultimately causes your nervous system to slowly shut down. It causes mental and nervous issues, and ultimately you die at a relatively young age for it. One of the big problems with Huntington's disease is the first symptoms don't typically show up until you're in your 40s, by which time you've probably had your children, And now, when you get it, you realize that probably 50% of your children are going to have it as well. And it's not a real pleasant way to go. So this young woman, after reading the article, was convinced that her maternal grandfather had died from Huntington's disease. And she went to her mother with her suspicions, and the mother said, no, that's ridiculous. He did not die from that. He basically was a crazy old man. He was in a mental institution, and he died of pneumonia. And don't worry about it. Well, so she decided to have a DNA test. And the DNA test revealed that she is a carrier for the Huntington's disease gene. And if that's the case, it means 100% that her mother will also develop Huntington's disease, which the mother really did not want to know. And so she went back to the family with her findings, and they basically cut her off entirely. Her mother refused to talk to her. Her sisters refused to talk to her going forward. For her, it changed her life in the sense that she decided, rather than get married and have children, which is what she had expected for herself, she threw herself into nursing and is not going to get married, is not going to have children, and is working now with patients who have Huntington's disease. And so it changed everything that she had in mind for herself. But the price that she had to pay was basically she lost most of her family. And that's, a thing that happens with this. So obviously DNA tests may have medical implications. Some of the DNA companies now test for various DNA of diseases that are genetically transmitted. And that can be everything from diabetes, type 1 diabetes, to things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other diseases that have at least some genetic component. They're not all strictly genetic in nature. And in fact, you can show a propensity to have those diseases and never get them. It's all a matter of luck. But again, the question may be in your own mind, if you are 50 years old today and you're testing your DNA, do you really want to know that you have a fair shot at developing Alzheimer's disease around your late 60s, early 70s, or Parkinson's disease, or other of these not very pleasant ways to go? And, what are you really going to change? There's nothing you can do about it. You either will or will not develop these conditions. But if you knew that you had a greater propensity, it's not going to change much of the way you lead your life, at least in theory. So just keep that in mind. It's an ethical issue. The one that we wrestle with a lot is that complete anonymity of DNA testing can never be 100% guaranteed. We've already seen situations where companies that do DNA testing have been bought out by other companies. Their terms and conditions have changed. There are a lot of things that the DNA community in particular worries about in terms of what is happening going forward with DNA research. There have not been any major breaches of security that I'm aware of. I'm not 100% sure what anybody else could do with my DNA. At least, it's not like hacking into my computer. I don't know. But, somebody will figure out something someday, possibly. And of course, once they're made publicly available, they can be freely accessed, copied, analyzed by a third party without permission. So as I'm going to talk about, there are a number of sites available where you can actually upload your DNA results, and it will improve substantially your chances of finding family members. But there is that caveat. And all of this comes courtesy and by permission from my good friend Judy Russell, the legal genealogist, who has written extensively about both ethical issues and legal issues regarding DNA and genealogy in general. So let's talk about testing the services and their ability to share. MyHeritage, very popular testing service, will accept uploads from Ancestry, DNA, and 23andMe. And they will add the information to their database, thereby widening the number of potential relatives that you may be able to connect with through MyHeritage. Ancestry DNA does not accept uploads. So you cannot share with Ancestry, but again, you can download and share. The same is true with 23andMe. So their information, you can't upload from other sources. Gedmatch.com will accept uploads from Family Tree DNA, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and a few others. And that will give you the best possible chance of finding a match. Bear in mind one thing, and may or may not make a difference to you. Law enforcement uses GEDmatch, and they're using it increasingly more and more. Many of you are probably familiar with CC Moore, who is a genetic genealogist and also a genetic genealogy detective. She helps to connect cold cases by using DNA to find potential perpetrators. And the fact that you didn't kill somebody, it doesn't matter. It could be a cousin, it could be your brother or sister that would be the criminal in this case, or the perpetrator, but your DNA would be close enough to get law enforcement interested in speaking with you about making a match. And this is what CC and her organization Parabon do. And that's something that you'll have to decide for yourself. If you had reason to suspect that your brother or sister had committed a crime, whether it's murder or rape or some other serious crime, how willing would you be to cooperate with law enforcement if you understood that that was probably going to put them in jail for a long period of time? But the bigger the pond, the more fish you catch. And that's really what it is when we're looking for relatives in DNA. And so in my story, it begins with back in 1952, I was born in Los Angeles, California. I was adopted at birth and had no information on my birth mother or father. I did know from as far back as I can remember that I was adopted. My adoptive parents were very happy to share that with me. I have subsequently found out that my birth mother was named Beverly Ann Burtis Strawn, and the father is unknown. And I'll come back to that because I have some very good clues, but I'll probably never know exactly the answer as to who my birth father was. California, of course, seals adoption records permanently. So there's no way for me to go back and see exactly what's on my original birth certificate. I do have my adoptive birth certificate, which has no information about my biological family whatsoever. I grew up in a very loving household. My parents were wonderful people. They're a nice Jewish couple from San Fernando. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. They adopted another boy when I was 2. My brother is now living in Port Angeles, Washington, and he's doing very well on his own. And he's much less interested in finding out about any of this stuff than I am. I actually was able to track down his birth mother. For him, that was of no particular interest, so we let it lie. I began tracing my adopted family in 1991. And from that, I was able to build a big tree, a fairly big tree, about 5,000 individuals dating back as far as the middle 17th century. In doing that, I had a lot of help from other family historians within the family. My mother had a third cousin who had written a book actually documenting the descendants of a guy who lived in Poland in 1740, and I'm in that book. So that helped a lot, and he was very helpful to me in helping to put that particular part of the tree together. And so he had a lot of information about that. I began tracing my biological family in 2009. Now, both of my adoptive parents were still alive and well. Neither one of them was able to offer me a whole lot of information. But my father subsequently came up with a piece of paper from the court from my adoption, signed by my birth mother, basically relinquishing care, custody, and control for life of me. it's kind of a weird feeling to have that, but I have that with her signature on it. And it's a meaningful piece of paper. And that, of course, helped me to determine exactly who she was. So let's talk about Beverly, first of all. Beverly was born August 27th, 1920 in Plainfield, New Jersey. Her parents were William and Lydia Fibel Burtis. William Burtis was a 9th generation US naval officer, and in fact, commanded a ship in World War II, ultimately became the commander of the Brooklyn Naval Yard in the late 40s and 50s until he retired from the Navy. And his ancestors fought on the Bonhomme Richard with John Paul Jones. So there's a connection there. It immediately makes me eligible for Sons of the American Revolution. Not that I have any plans in particular right now of joining that organization, but technically I can. She died on August 23rd, 2005 in Northridge, California. So I never got an opportunity to meet her. I know a lot of stuff about her, both from my research and, as you'll see, with help from other members of that family. She was married in 1939 to a man named Glenn Strawn. Glenn Strawn was an aircraft mechanic and happened to live near her, and that's how they met. By this time, she was living in Burbank, California. Glenn also was living in Burbank, California. They had 2 sons. The first one was John Harold Strawn. He was born on November 13th, 1939. And for those of you sitting at home and doing the notes or doing the math, you probably have figured out that she probably married Glenn in a hurry. But that's the way it goes. There was a lot of that going on back in those days, despite the fact that some people seem to think that that never happened before Roe v. Wade. And that's as far as I'm going to get into politics today. She had a second son, or they had a second son, Robert William Strawn, who was born on May 4th, 1941. There is some good news, and I'll come back to that in a moment. She did divorce Glenn Strawn in 1946. And I have some of the paperwork from that. Some of that remains sealed in California. John Harold Strawn died in February of 1953, or about less than a year after I was born. And as it turns out, he and his brother, Robert, who died in 1960, both had the same defective kidney ailment that killed them. And in those days, it was almost entirely fatal. It is inherited. And since nobody else in the family seems to have had it, and Glenn Strawn ultimately died from kidney failure, I'm assuming that John and Robert were both sons of Glenn Strawn. Finally, she had a baby boy born in February of 1951. He died the next day. And he died of prematurity. And I have the death certificates for the 3 sons indicating the cause of death. So the first step was family tree DNA. I won a test in a raffle at my local Jewish Genealogy Society, and I took the Y-DNA exam, and lo and behold, I get back a message that you have a first cousin. Well, hey, that's pretty close, and he's on the paternal side, right? So I contacted him. His name is Stan Wilson. He lives up in the Pacific Northwest. And he was adopted at birth and has absolutely no information about his birth parents. In fact, he tested with family tree DNA, trying to find the same kind of information that I was looking for. So now, we've been in touch, but he has still not developed anything about his own parentage. So that's when I began to really research Beverly Strawn and found out, of course, that she had passed away. So I found some information through family tree DNA, but not much. I contacted people up to the fifth cousin range, or tried to make contact with them. Many of them did not respond, and others who did really had no information for me, at least at that time. I'll come back to that. However, I have managed over time now to narrow down the possibilities to one of two men. I actually found a third cousin that tested in 2019, and she was able to tell me that there was a family story that her great uncle had moved to California with his son after becoming estranged from the family in Kansas in the late 1940s. And I determined through city directories that the two of them lived a couple of blocks away from Beverly Strawn. So one of them obviously is going to be, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but is likely to be, based on the DNA, my father. The problem is both the father and the son, you know, Beverly fell somewhere in the middle. The father is 9 years older than Beverly. The son is 7 years younger. And either one of them are possibilities. Both of them are deceased, and neither of them left any descendants, direct descendants, that we could test and verify anything from. So we've kind of narrowed it down to it's going to be one of the two of them. And that's just all we can do at this point. I don't think that's a brick wall that I'm ever going to be able to break, unless somehow I can get access to my original birth certificate and find a name on it. You know, more than likely the name is going to be unknown. So I have not pushed that aspect of it anymore. I've reached out to a couple of other new relatives who pop up from time to time on family tree DNA, and I have not found anybody since who had anything in particular that they could add to the story. In 2017, I got bought an Ancestry DNA kit and tested there. And the results came in early May, so about 8 weeks later. By the way, that's fairly typical for DNA testing. I see a lot of postings on Facebook and other places. You know, I sent something off to this testing company or that testing company 2 weeks ago. I haven't heard anything. You know, what's happening? Do you think it got lost in the mail? No, there's a lead time in getting answers to this, and part of that depends on how busy they are. I've noticed from the pattern that I see that particularly people are testing around this time of the year. It's going to take a while to get your results back. And the main reason for that is that an awful lot of people give the Ancestry DNA or one of the other DNA kits as holiday presents. So there are an awful lot of people testing right now and sending their results in. Labs get overwhelmed for a while. Just keep that in mind. First thing I learned from Ancestry was that my daughter had tested her DNA. I didn't know that. She showed up as my daughter, thank God. Not that I had any doubts, but it was good to see that confirmed. And she has found some interesting things on her maternal side of the family that expanded her understanding of that side of the family quite a bit. And she and I have discussed this over the years. But I haven't made any new connections that would be of great help to me in ascertaining anything about the family. So the next place I tested, and again, I won the test in a raffle. It's good to go to your JGS meetings. They do have giveaways and raffles and things. And I won a 23andMe test in a raffle. And I tested again in March of 2017, I think about a week after I sent in the results to Ancestry. So I got an email of matches the day before my birthday, and I opened it up figuring, okay, well, you know, now I've got some third and fourth cousins that I can try and see if I can find anything different. And suddenly it was like bingo. I had 1,382 DNA relatives, again, not terribly uncommon in this testing. And one of them was listed as a half sister. That was not expected. Not at all. I had no idea whatsoever that I had any other siblings in this world. And there she was. And she is my half sister. It's very clear that she falls right in the middle of what we would expect for a half sister in terms of the DNA matches. And her son, who was also tested, lists out as a first cousin because he could be a first cousin, he could be a nephew, and again, half of each. As it turns out, he is her son. And the story there is that, of course, she was also adopted at birth. Her son knew that she had been adopted at birth. He tested with 23andMe for the medical part of it to find out if he had any particular DNA issues that he should be aware of. And then he suggested to her that she test. And she said, all right. And eventually she did. That was about 2012 that she had tested. And she kind of ignored the stuff that was coming through about, we found 1,400 new matches for you. That wasn't her interest. Her main interest was to find out if there's anything health-wise that I should know about any inherited illnesses that I might have. So different people test for different reasons. Well, of course, she had no idea of anything. She knew less than I did. I have to tell you, as soon as I got that result, I sent her a message through 23andMe because they don't allow you to post your email addresses. And she responded very quickly back to me that, she was not very knowledgeable about her family history. She'd never done the research. It was not, again, of particular importance to her. But she was born in 1948 in Los Angeles. She was adopted at birth. And she grew up not really knowing much about her biological family. She knew she had been adopted. She knew that, or she heard stories at least that indicated that there might be some Hispanic in her background. She grew up with a loving family. A younger brother was subsequently adopted. And she and I were Beverly's only survivors. Again, everybody else passed away at a young and rather tender age. So that, of course, revitalized my search effort. I started more searching through Ancestry, started digging deeper into contacting relatives through Ancestry, through 23andMe, and I began looking for more records from Family Search. I was able to find the death certificates for Beverly and her 3 children through Family Search. That was very helpful to me. And again, as I say, it indicated that the 2 boys had died from an inherited ailment that was untreatable at the time. Today, medicine has found ways to treat it, and it's no longer the problem that it used to be. And so I began actively really contacting my DNA matches. Now, all of a sudden, I'm on the warpath. Well, Family Search has a family tree drawn up that traces the family back to 11th century France. It's kind of cool. The family is not Jewish, I have to tell you, they are Catholic. And so from a biological standpoint, I am not really Jewish, but I certainly consider myself that way and have lived that way all my life. Then I got lucky. And this is where you find things that you are not expecting to find. I found a cousin who knew Beverly, who remembered her. He's listed as a 4th cousin on Ancestry DNA. We've sort of figured out that we're probably 3rd cousins as a biological relationship, but it gets even more interesting than that. He and I went to high school together in Southern California. We graduated in the same graduating class. And in fact, when we made the connection after a long phone call, I went back to my high school yearbook. He went back to his high school yearbook. We both had the same reaction. I remember that guy. We weren't particularly friends in high school. We, had a passing acquaintance. We probably had a few classes together, and I went to a rather large high school. We graduated in a class of 885. So, there were an awful lot of opportunities for me not to really know all the people I went to high school with, but I knew who he was. And I thought, wow, that's really amazing. Of course, he and I at that time had absolutely no idea. He said, I have another cousin who is a family historian. She knows a whole lot more about Beverly than I do. And maybe you should talk to her. Can I pass your contact information to her? And of course, I said, absolutely. So he shared with her my story that I had given him. And her one-word reaction was, wow. She had no idea that Beverly had other children. Nobody in the family apparently knew that fact. And she knew Beverly fairly well because she was a daughter of Beverly's older brother. So pretty amazing. She sent me a long informational letter. It was just a wonderful, a wonderful email detailing an awful lot of history about Beverly, whom she knew fairly well. Being her niece. And she started out that letter with, welcome to our dysfunctional family. So I figure now that I got very lucky getting adopted. It probably would not have been nearly as good growing up with her as a mother. With all due respect to her and her family, she was described as being kind of the black sheep of the family, which of course may explain why nobody realized that she had other children other than the 3 that they knew about. The family has been here for a long time. She has a document in Dutch of a marriage that took place in Bushwick, Brooklyn in 1623. So they were here before the English. So the family has been here in the New World for a very long time. She had pictures. Now, I had never seen a picture of my biological mother. I over the years had kind of a vision of what I thought she might look like, none of which turned out to be the case, but she had the pictures and she sent them along. Now understand, I'm sitting at a concert, a big outdoor venue here called Jones Beach, and idly reading my email when I came across her letter. When I opened up the attachments, which were these 2 pictures that you see here on your screen, I burst into tears. And people sitting around me must have been going, what's wrong with that guy? I don't know. I had this feeling like people were edging away from me. I couldn't help it. I mean, this is one of the most emotional moments that I've had since my children were born. And so the first picture is her in about 1940, or about 12 years before I was born, as a young woman. And the second picture was taken in 1995 with her brother and a niece, not the one that contacted me. And at that time, she was in her 80s. And as I say, she passed away about 10 years later. She had Alzheimer's in her later years and passed away in a nursing home. But as you can probably imagine and appreciate, it's a very emotional thing for me. These are her parents, William and Lydia Burtis. And William, as I said, the picture on the left was taken right after his graduation from the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. And she was a nurse. This was at the beginning of World War I. And the other picture was him as a young naval officer with his wife. And they lived in New Jersey until the Navy started transferring them around. Ultimately, he wound up in the late 30s in California, based out of Long Beach, California, the naval station there, and spent the war years in that area as well. So finally, my sister, well, we had the email, so we had to meet. And I flew out to Southern California, and we got together for lunch and a very long and warm and wonderful conversation. She turns out to be one of the nicer people in my life. We talk quite regularly. She was able to meet and get to know a little bit my father before he passed away. Unfortunately, we met at a time when my mother was very ill, and she didn't get to meet my mother. But she has been just a wonderful person to talk with, and such a big and wonderful surprise. And she knows how I feel because I've told her that several times, but she's hearing it again now publicly. She's here on this webinar, I believe. So what next? Well, there are still mysteries to be solved. Obviously, I know nothing about my birth father, and we're working on that one. And hopefully we'll get some answers somewhere down the road, but I'm not really expecting that we're ever going to quite solve that mystery. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. So I noticed that there are some questions in the Q&A. Let me go there. And again, as I say, my email address is here on the lower left-hand corner of the slide. And you are welcome to drop me an email. You have questions about this. If you have questions about Ukraine, because I'm happy to talk about that as well. Not obviously the topic of this particular program, but I get a lot of email about Ukraine, and I am very good about answering as quickly as I can. Relly says, I sound identical to a teacher that I had once down to the choice of expressions, looks, and voice. As far as I know, I don't have any doppelgangers. I don't know that for a fact, but I have no evidence that I have a twin out there. But thank you, I guess. Hopefully you like the teacher. Is there any likelihood of California changing its rules regarding sealing of adoption records? Well, this has been a battle that has been fought several times in the California legislature. They've never been able to get up to enough of a critical mass. It will take an act of the legislature to change the rules. And, you know, you maintain hope. A number of states now have loosened up their adoption rules. New Jersey, New York have all lightened up on the sealing of adoption records. There will be more to come, I'm sure. They're not the only states, by the way. So yeah, eventually I think that that will happen. When, I couldn't tell you. I'm not a particular expert in California politics these days. I moved here to New York about 20 years ago, and I just have not been able to follow everything that goes on in California. But I know that there are actively people that are trying to find that kind of information. Pennsylvania records, I got to be honest with you, not an expert. I believe that records in Pennsylvania have been partially unsealed, but I really can't tell you. What I would suggest that you do is contact the Pennsylvania Department of Health, who maintains the birth records, and they can give you a better answer to that question. I'm not the expert on other states. There are a number, if you're on Facebook, there are a number of organizations that cater to adoptees from various states. So if you go into the Facebook search and type Pennsylvania adoptions, you'll find at least a couple of Facebook groups that may have much more information on that than I do. What is the best way to sort through third through fifth cousin matches to find the ones that are closer to third cousins? That's tough. The easiest way that I can suggest that you do that with any of these is to go ahead and search or organize them by closest relationship. Most of them give you an opportunity to do that, or the largest segment matches is also a way to do that. You know, because after you get beyond first cousin, the possibilities get a little bit wider and wider, because again, I'm inheriting about 50% from each parent, give or take a few percent. Each parent has inherited about 50% from each of their parents, give or take. And the further we go back, the fewer matches I'm going to have with descendants of those individuals as they spread out in the family tree. So, you know, the best answer I can give you is just try and sort it out as best as you possibly can. Let's see, what else have I got here? What's the most sensitive way to break the news to someone they have a previously unknown half sibling? Well, I'll tell you, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be in therapy, either giving it or receiving it. I'm not sure which. You know, I wrestled with that a little bit before I made contact with my sister, but I figured, you know, you might as well be direct. Now, if it's a situation where the half sibling is as the result of what is called an NPE, a not parent expected or non-parental event, that's a problem. As I say, I have a friend that found out that the next door neighbor was her biological father, and he had a whole family. She made contact with them, and they have become very close with her. That's not going to be the same reception in every family. There's no good answer because everybody responds differently. I know of a number of people that have had parents that were not expected. Their father was not their father, and the person who was the father was married with family of his own at the time, and have gotten everything from "don't ever contact me again," or "I'm going to call the police on you," or "sick lawyers on you," or whatever, all the way to warm acceptance. So there's absolutely no way to know how somebody on the other end is going to respond. And again, as far as the most sensitive way, my own feeling is be direct. You can't really beat around the bush with stuff like this. My grandfather was from Odessa. What's the best way to find his name before he emigrated? Somebody from Ukraine. Nancy, let me put it this way. The best way to find out would be to find, if possible, his naturalization papers. Logically, they will say under what name he entered New York on a passenger manifest. And then you can find the manifest with that name on it and verify that that individual is the same person. Generally, the naturalization certificates do say, not the certificates, but the paperwork says what city or town I was born in and what name I arrived in New York on such and such a date. Again, this is for naturalizations after 1906. If it's before 1906, it's a lot harder. But that's where I would start. Best way to motivate DNA matches to respond to your inquiries, I wish I knew. I have a lot of DNA matches that I have never heard from, that I have tried to make contact with. Not only do I want to know, the mystery of my father, but it would also be interesting to know a little bit more about the people in my ancestry and who they are, what they did, where they lived, how they lived, where they came from, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question, Carol. I'm sorry. Does my sister share the same father? No. And that's where it gets really interesting. My birth mother, after getting divorced, apparently knew how to have a good time. That's really all I can say, other than her family, as I said, regarded her as kind of the black sheep of the family. Her father supported her financially a lot during her adult years. She was a bookkeeper. I don't imagine she made a lot of money. She lived in a very modest apartment building in Burbank, California, which is still standing to this day. But she was not a wealthy woman by any means. And, so I know that about her. My sister's father, the DNA shows clearly some Hispanic heritage there. And she had heard a rumor about he possibly being an ambassador or a diplomat from a Latin American country. Don't know. Probably will never know unless that side of the family gets more involved in testing. Let's see here. Any other questions? I think I've gotten all the ones that were here in the Q&A. Let me go over to chat and see. You have a problem with an adopted son possibly being the daughter's son. That happens a lot. And unfortunately, that's the way that it went in those days. When a young woman became pregnant, oftentimes, if the family was not trying to force her to give the baby away, the parents kind of adopted the child and took care of him. So that's what happens. Somebody else asking about Stanislav, Poland, became part of the Ukraine. Records for Stanislav are in Poland. If you go to Miriam Weiner's wonderful website, which is called RTRF, Routes to Roots Foundation.org, you can look for almost any place in Eastern Europe, and it will tell you where birth, marriage, and death records and other vital records can be found, and what years that are known to exist. It's not a complete list, but it's a long list. Is there a big difference between what you can find out from Ancestry or Family Search? Well, of course, Family Search doesn't do DNA. Family Search is simply a listing of documents. The Family Search people are part of the Mormon Church. They go all over the world collecting documents and records, mostly birth, marriage, and death records from wherever they can get them. And they've been doing this for a number of years. They have a much larger database of names and records than Ancestry does. And it's very unfocused. For example, they have New York City birth indexes that Ancestry does not have since 1909. And you can also get the actual records from Family Search at the moment for people born before 1909, where you can't with Ancestry. So you can get a copy of the birth certificate or the death certificate for a family member before the years, at least, that New York has embargoed, New York City, talking about, has embargoed them. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff on Family Search, and you got to go, again, the bigger the pond you fish in, the more fish you're likely to catch. So Family Search, Ancestry, all of these are great record sources, and we go from there. Let's see here. And thank you all for the nice, kind words that you put in here. That's I really appreciate that, and I'm hoping that Avrami can get me a transcript of the chat and the Q&A. Let me see if there's anything else in the Q&A here that I want to just touch on real quickly. Birth records from Pennsylvania. I don't know when you tried to get those records. Pennsylvania has changed their rules recently. It depends. I don't know. Yeah, it would have taken a court order before. It may still take a court order. It depends on when you were born. I have not found, the surname of my biological father is Cole, C-O-L-E. Not particularly helpful. I've done a little research. The family settled in the Midwest as early as the early 1800s, mostly in Kansas, and most of them are still in Kansas today. I do have cousins there. The father was married, his wife died, and so his son was living with him for all those years. I have, neither the father nor the son are available for testing, unfortunately. I can't do a comparison. I have no information on the mother. Nobody seems to remember her name. And let's see. Yeah, you're going to find that a lot of people are going to shut the research down. Somebody notes that in their family, somebody found out that their father was not really him, and he was Italian. And there's not much more you can do about that. When people don't want to talk about it, it gets really tough. Death certificates in Pennsylvania, you'll have to Google the question. I believe it's the Pennsylvania Department of Health. I do belong on the adoptive family tree. I have an awful lot of really wonderful cousins who were there when my father died for me, that have been very helpful, and I feel a great deal of connection to that ancestry. I'm really happy that I can trace my Jewish ancestry back as far as I can. I have no way to know whether I share the same father as Beverly's baby. My guess is maybe not. I just don't know. I thank you. As far as records in other states, the best way to find that information is Google birth records. Somebody's asking about Ohio. I don't know. But if you Google birth records Ohio, you'll find out where they are and for what years they are available. Different states have put different embargoes, mostly in recent years, on certain birth and death records. New York has had embargoes for years, and so no records since 1909 have been released for birth records in New York City. New York City is different from New York State. They have two separate things. And so as a result of that, if you're looking for somebody who was born in New York after 1909, in order to get a copy of a birth record, you have to be a lineal descendant. And you have to provide information for that that is satisfactory to the city's health department, which maintains all of those records. 2 years ago, the health department adopted a new regulation that embargoes birth records now for 125 years. So there won't be any more birth records from New York being released until 2034, which is a long time from now. But yeah, every state has their own rules. I would say Google the question. Google is your friend. And with that, Avrami, I think we've got it covered.
Chuck, thank you for sharing this very personal story. And I think that not only was it interesting, but it could prove helpful to others who are in the same situation you were in. And we thank you very much for taking the time and for being part of this program. Later this afternoon, everyone should please be on the lookout for an email from us. It will include a link to the recording of Chuck's program. There will also be a survey to let us know your thoughts and what suggestions you might have for the future. And there will also be a link to register for next week's program. Next week's program will be the final talk, the final Jewish Gen talk on DNA. It will be with Gail Bardage, and he will be offering a refresher, pretty much taking everything we've learned over the last 3 weeks and bringing it all together, summarizing it. And the goal will be, in his words, now I understand, I get it, I know what to do. That is what you should be able to walk away from at the end of this month when it comes to utilizing DNA for your family research. So we thank you, Chuck, again, for taking the time today. I thank all of you who logged in from around the world, and I hope that we will see you next week for part 4 and the final part of this DNA series. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.